The red sandstone cliffs of Utah Territory's canyonlands offered no mercy to those who dared enter their maze unprepared. Isabella Rodriguez stumbled barefoot across razor-sharp rocks, her wedding dress torn to ribbons and stained with blood from countless cuts, while the thundering hoofbeats of Jeremiah Blackston's hunting party echoed through the narrow gorges behind her. What she couldn't know was that these same treacherous canyons held an ancient guardian, a Lakota warrior whose own tragic past would intertwine with her desperate flight in ways that would transform them both forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The scorching August sun of 1889 beat down mercilessly on the Utah Badlands as Isabella pressed herself against the cool shade of an overhanging cliff, her chest heaving with exhaustion and terror. She had been running for 3 days now, surviving on nothing but rainwater collected in rock pools and the bitter berries that grew in hidden crevices. Her feet, once soft from a life of indoor work, were now bloodied and swollen. But the sound of distant dogs kept her moving deeper into the labyrinthine canyons. Just 4 months ago, she had been Isabella Santos, a seamstress in the bustling Mexican quarter of San Antonio, Texas. Her nimble fingers had earned a modest living, creating beautiful embroidered dresses for the wives of wealthy ranchers and merchants. But when her father died in a construction accident, leaving behind crushing debts that threatened to destroy her family, Isabella had made the desperate decision that now haunted every waking moment. She had answered an advertisement in the San Antonio Express. Prosperous Utah rancher seeks refined lady for matrimony. Comfortable home and secure future guaranteed. Only serious inquiries from women of good character need apply. The letters from Jeremiah Blackstone had seemed like divine intervention. His penmanship was educated. His descriptions of his vast ranch in the Utah Territory painted pictures of prosperity and respectability. He wrote of thousands of acres of grazing land, a substantial 2-story house with modern conveniences, and his desire for a cultured wife who could bring refinement to his frontier holdings. Most importantly, he had offered to pay Isabella's family debts immediately upon their engagement, with the understanding that she would travel to Utah for their wedding. Isabella's mother, Maria Santos, had been initially suspicious of such generous terms from a stranger, but with creditors threatening to seize their small home and Isabella's younger siblings facing destitution, the offer seemed like their only salvation. Isabella had convinced herself that growing affection could develop between herself and this apparently honorable man, especially if he proved as kind and respectable as his letters suggested. The journey to Utah Territory had taken 3 weeks, by train and stagecoach, carrying Isabella further from everything familiar with each passing mile. When she finally arrived at the dusty frontier town of Moab, Jeremiah Blackstone had been waiting at the stage station as promised. Her first glimpse of her intended husband had sent an involuntary chill through her, despite the desert heat. The man who approached her was indeed Jeremiah Blackstone. She recognized him from the photograph he had sent, but his pale blue eyes held a coldness that his letters had never conveyed. Blackstone was a man of perhaps 45 years, tall and lean, with prematurely grey hair and hands that seemed too soft for someone who claimed to work a cattle ranch. His smile, when he greeted Isabella, never reached his eyes, and she noticed how other people in the town seemed to avoid looking directly at him. Even the stage driver, a grizzled man who had seen every type of frontier character, appeared nervous. In Blackstone's presence, "Miss Santos," Blackstone had said, his voice carrying a cultured Eastern accent that seemed oddly out of place in the rough frontier town. "You're even more lovely than your photograph suggested. I trust your journey wasn't too arduous?" Isabella had managed to smile and respond appropriately, but something deep in her instincts had begun sending warning signals. The way Blackstone looked at her felt more like a man appraising livestock than a prospective husband greeting his bride. When he helped her into his wagon for the journey to his ranch, his hands lingered on her waist in a way that made her skin crawl. The ride to Blackstone's ranch had taken them deep into the canyon country, following narrow trails that wound between towering red rock formations. As they traveled further from Moab, Isabella began to understand just how isolated her new life would be. Miles passed without any sign of other human habitation, just endless expanses of red rock desert broken by deep canyons and mesas that stretched to the horizon. "Beautiful country, isn't it?" Blackstone had commented, noting her wide-eyed reaction to the dramatic landscape. "A man can do whatever he pleases out here without interference from busybodies and law enforcement." The comment had struck Isabella as oddly phrased, but she had attributed it to the different attitudes of frontier life. Only later would she understand the sinister implications of his words. Blackstone's ranch, when they finally reached it as the sun was setting, proved to be a substantial operation, but not quite what his letters had described. The main house was indeed 2 stories, but it had a forbidding aspect that the approaching darkness seemed to emphasize. Outbuildings scattered around the property suggested a working ranch, but Isabella noticed an unusual number of men lounging around the bunkhouse and corrals, far more hands than seemed necessary for legitimate ranching operations. "Welcome to Broken Canyon Ranch," Blackstone had announced with evident pride. 20,000 acres of the finest grazing land in Utah Territory, and all of it mine. Isabella had been shown to a room on the 2nd floor of the house, a space that was comfortable enough but felt oddly like a prison cell. The window looked out over the ranch yard, but she noticed that the glass was barred, supposedly, Blackstone explained, to keep out the occasional mountain lion or bear that wandered down from the high country. That first evening, Isabella had joined Blackstone for dinner in his spacious dining room. The meal was well prepared and elegantly served, but the conversation had filled her with growing unease. Blackstone asked detailed questions about her family in San Antonio, wanting to know about their debts, their social connections, and whether anyone would come looking for her if she failed to write letters home. "Not that anything would happen to you, my dear," he had said with that cold smile, "but a man in my position has to be careful about his associations. There are people who might try to use a man's wife against him if they knew where to find her." When Isabella asked about the nature of his business that would create such enemies, Blackstone's expression had hardened. "Let's just say that I've found ways to prosper in this territory that more conventional men might not appreciate. But those details need not concern a woman." That night, alone in her barred room, Isabella had written a cheerful letter to her family, describing her safe arrival and the beauty of the Utah landscape. But she had found herself unable to mention many details about Blackstone himself, or the strange atmosphere she sensed around the ranch. Something was very wrong here, but she couldn't yet articulate exactly what it was. The next morning brought the first clear indication of the trap she had entered. Isabella had awakened to find that her door was locked from the outside. When she called out, a Mexican woman named Consuela appeared with breakfast and an explanation that chilled Isabella's blood. "Senor Blackstone, he says you are not to leave this room until after the wedding ceremony," Consuela explained in accented English, her eyes avoiding Isabella's. "He says sometimes new brides get nervous and try to run away before they understand how good their life will be here." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. Isabella had demanded to speak with Blackstone immediately, but Consuela just shook her head sadly. "Senor Blackstone is very Busy with ranch business today. He will see you tonight for dinner, and tomorrow you will be married as planned." The next 24 hours had passed in a nightmarish blur. Isabella had tried everything she could think of to escape the locked room, picking at the lock with hairpins, trying to break the barred window, even attempting to climb down from the second-story window using bed sheets tied together. Nothing worked, and she began to realize that her situation was far more desperate than she had initially understood. Consuela, when she brought meals, had proven to be a potential source of information. The woman had worked at the ranch for several years and had seen other young women arrive as Blackstone's intended brides. Isabella's blood had run cold when she learned that she was not the first mail-order bride to answer Blackstone's advertisements. "What happened to the others?" Isabella had asked, though she dreaded the answer. Consuela's expression had become haunted. "Some of them, they learned to accept their situation. They live in the house, like prisoners, but prisoners with comfortable cells. Others—" She had shaken her head and refused to say more. That evening, Blackstone had arrived for dinner dressed in his finest clothes, acting as though Isabella's imprisonment was perfectly normal. He had spoken casually about their wedding ceremony, planned for the following morning, and his expectations for their marriage. "You'll find that life here can be quite pleasant once you accept the realities of your situation," he had said over wine that Isabella refused to touch. "I can provide you with every comfort, fine clothes, books, even musical instruments if you have such interests. All I require is your complete cooperation and discretion." When Isabella had demanded to know what he meant by discretion, Blackstone's facade had finally slipped completely. His voice had become hard and threatening as he explained that his ranch served as headquarters for a network of cattle rustlers, claim jumpers, and worse criminals who found the isolated canyon country perfect for their operations. "You see, my dear Isabella, I've discovered that having a respectable wife provides excellent cover for a man in my line of work," he had said with chilling matter-of-factness. "Local authorities are much less likely to investigate a married rancher than a bachelor with mysterious sources of income, and if questions are ever asked, a wife can provide alibis and respectability that money alone cannot buy." Isabella had finally understood the full horror of her situation. She wasn't being married for love or even companionship. She was being acquired as a piece of property to legitimize Blackstone's criminal operations. The comfortable room, the fine clothes, the cultured conversation, all of it was window dressing for what amounted to slavery. "And if I refuse?" she had asked, though she already knew the answer. Blackstone's smile had become truly frightening. "Then you'll join the previous wives who found cooperation difficult. There are canyons out there so deep and remote that bodies are never found." That night, Isabella had lain awake planning her escape with desperate determination. She had noticed during her imprisonment that the ranch's security was focused on preventing outsiders from discovering Blackstone's operations, not on keeping women inside the house. The bars on her window were meant to keep dangers out, not to keep her in. They could be removed from the inside with sufficient effort and the right tools, using a combination of hairpins, a nail file from her traveling kit, and hours of patient work. Isabella had managed to loosen the window bars enough to squeeze through. Just before dawn, wearing her sturdiest dress and carrying only a small bag with water and a few pieces of bread stolen from her dinner tray, she had lowered herself from the second-story window and begun her flight into the canyon wilderness. To tea. First day of her escape had been almost dreamlike in its terror and beauty. The canyon country was unlike anything Isabella had ever experienced. Vast expanses of red rock carved by ancient waters into fantastic formations that seemed more like the landscape of another planet than anything earthly. She had followed animal trails and dry stream beds, trying to put as much distance as possible between herself and Blackstone's ranch before her absence was discovered. But by midday, the desert heat had become almost unbearable. Isabella's Mexican heritage had prepared her for hot weather, but nothing had prepared her for the intensity of the high desert sun reflecting off red sandstone. Her water ran out by afternoon, and she was forced to search for the hidden springs and seeps that sustained life in this harsh landscape. The second day had brought the sounds of pursuit. Blackstone's men had followed her trail with dogs and horses, and Isabella could hear their voices echoing off the canyon walls as they systematically searched every possible hiding place. She had been forced to travel at night, using the stars. Her father had taught her to identify during their evenings together in San Antonio. Now, on the third day, Isabella knew she was failing. Her strength was nearly exhausted, her feet were too damaged to carry her much further, and the sounds of pursuit were getting closer. She had managed to lose the dogs by wading through a narrow stream for several miles, but she knew it was only a temporary reprieve. As the afternoon heat reached its peak, Isabella crawled into the shade of a massive boulder and closed her eyes, trying to conserve what little energy remained. She thought of her family in San Antonio, wondering if they would ever learn what had really happened to her. She thought of the other women who had answered Blackstone's advertisements and wondered how many had died in these same canyons. But as despair began to overwhelm her, Isabella heard something that made her heart skip, voices speaking in a language she didn't recognize, coming from somewhere above her hiding place. The voices didn't sound like Blackstone's men, and they seemed to be moving with the canyon rather than fighting against it. Looking up through the gap in the rocks, Isabella caught a glimpse of figures moving along the canyon rim with impossible grace and silence. One of them, silhouetted against the brilliant blue sky, seemed to be looking directly down at her hiding place. For a moment, their eyes met across the distance, and Isabella saw something in that stranger's gaze that she hadn't seen since leaving San Antonio, genuine human compassion. Then the figure was gone, and Isabella was left wondering if exhaustion and desperation had made her imagine the encounter. But as the sun began to set and the sounds of Blackstone's search party grew closer, Isabella realized that her desperate flight through the canyons was about to enter a new phase. Someone else was watching, someone who moved through this harsh landscape like they belonged to it, and she could only hope that whoever they were, they might prove to be allies rather than additional threats. The mail-order bride who had come to Utah Territory seeking security had instead found herself hunted like an animal through some of the most unforgiving terrain in North America. But the canyons that threatened to become her tomb might also hold her salvation. If she could survive long enough to discover what intentions lay behind those compassionate eyes she had glimpsed on the rim above. The ancient Lakota warrior known as Soaring Eagle had been tracking the white men's hunting party for 2 days, moving like a ghost through terrain that had been sacred to his people long before any European had ever seen the red canyons of the Colorado Plateau. From his vantage point on the canyon rim, he could see everything. The desperate woman fleeing through the maze below, the armed men following her trail with dogs and horses, and the deadly game of cat and mouse that was playing out in the sacred spaces his grandfather had once called home. At 32 years old, Soaring Eagle carried the weight of tragedy that had driven him from his tribal lands in the Black Hills to these remote canyons where few men dared to venture. His face, marked by a distinctive scar that ran from his left ear to the corner of his mouth, told the story of his last battle with the cavalry soldiers who had destroyed his village 3 winters ago. The scar was a reminder of the morning, when he had lost everything that mattered. His wife, Mourning Dove, his infant son, Little Bear, and 17 other members of his band who had been murdered while trying to surrender under a white flag. The soldiers had called it a victory against hostile Indians. Soaring Eagle called it the day his heart died, and his path became one of solitary wandering through the vast wilderness that still offered refuge to those who refused to accept the white man's reservations. He had sworn never again to trust any Wasiku, any white person, yet something about the woman stumbling through the canyons below challenged that bitter resolve. Through his field glasses, stolen from a cavalry officer he had killed in Montana Territory, Soaring Eagle studied the fleeing woman with growing interest. She was not what he had expected to find in this remote corner of Utah Territory. Her dark hair and olive skin suggested Mexican heritage, and her movements showed intelligence and determination, despite obvious exhaustion. Most intriguingly, she carried herself with a dignity that persisted even in desperate circumstances. The men pursuing her were a different story entirely. Soaring Eagle had encountered their type many times during his years of guerrilla warfare against white expansion. Brutal men who used violence and intimidation to take what they wanted, whether it was land, gold, cattle, or women. The leader, a tall man with prematurely grey hair who rode a distinctive black stallion, directed the hunt with the casual cruelty of someone who had done this before. From fragments of conversation that carried on the desert wind, Soaring Eagle had learned enough to understand the basic situation. The woman was a runaway bride who had escaped from the grey-haired man's ranch. The pursuers spoke of bringing her back alive, but their crude jokes about what would happen to her after recapture left no doubt about her fate if they succeeded. Normally, Soaring Eagle would have avoided involvement in white people's conflicts. His survival over the past 3 years had depended on remaining invisible, striking only when necessary to obtain supplies or eliminate specific threats, then disappearing back into the wilderness before organized retaliation could find him. But something about this particular hunt stirred memories he had tried to bury. The fleeing woman reminded him of Mourning Dove, not in physical appearance, but in the fierce determination he could see even from a distance. His wife had fought just as desperately to protect their son when the soldiers attacked their camp, showing the same refusal to surrender that he now observed in the stranger below. The parallel was too painful and too compelling to ignore. As the afternoon heat reached its brutal peak, Soaring Eagle watched the woman collapse into the shade of a massive boulder, her strength clearly failing. The pursuing men were less than 2 miles behind her now, following a trail that would lead them directly to her hiding place within hours. If he was going to act, the time for decision had arrived. Moving with the silent efficiency that had kept him alive through countless raids and ambushes, Soaring Eagle began his descent into the canyon system. The route he chose would bring him to the woman's location well ahead of her pursuers, using paths that existed only in the memories of those who understood how water and wind had carved these red rock formations over countless generations. His grandfather, Wise Bear, had brought him to these canyons as a child, teaching him to read the subtle signs that revealed hidden springs, defendable positions, and escape routes that could confuse even experienced trackers. That knowledge, combined with skills learned during years of warfare against technologically superior enemies, made Soaring Eagle uniquely qualified to turn the hunters into the hunted. But first, he needed to determine whether the woman was worth the risk he was contemplating. His bitter experience had taught him that not all victims were innocent, and not all apparent rescues led to gratitude rather than betrayal. He had learned these lessons through pain and blood, and he would not make the same mistakes again. Isabella Santos Rodriguez had reached the absolute limit of her endurance when she heard the soft footfall on rock behind her hiding place. Her water had been gone since morning, her feet were too damaged to carry her much further, and the heat was beginning to cause the dangerous confusion that preceded death by exposure. She had been drifting in and out of consciousness, dreaming. of her mother's cool kitchen in San Antonio and the sound of her younger siblings playing in their small courtyard. The sound that brought her fully awake was so subtle that she almost dismissed it as imagination. The whisper of moccasined feet on sandstone, barely audible above the desert wind. But when she opened her eyes and looked toward the entrance of her rocky shelter, Isabella's heart nearly stopped. A man stood silhouetted against the blazing afternoon sky, but he was unlike anyone she had ever seen. Tall and powerfully built, with long black hair braided with what appeared to be eagle feathers, he wore a mixture of traditional Indian clothing and practical frontier gear that suggested someone who lived between two worlds. His face was marked by a distinctive scar, but his dark eyes held an intelligence and awareness that made Isabella think of her grandfather, who had possessed the same quality of seeming to see everything while revealing nothing. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Isabella's mind raced through the possibilities. Was this another of Blackstone's men, dressed in Indian garb for some reason? A hostile Indian who might prove even more dangerous than her original captors? Or could this be the source of the compassionate gaze she had glimpsed from the canyon rim? The stranger resolved her uncertainty by speaking in accented but clear Spanish. "Senora, you are in great danger. The men who hunt you will be here within the hour." Isabella's relief at hearing her native language was so overwhelming that tears sprang to her eyes. "You speak Spanish," she whispered, her voice barely audible from thirst and exhaustion. "I speak 7 languages," the man replied, switching to English. "Spanish from traders in Santa Fe, English from missionaries and soldiers, French from trappers in the north. Words are tools, like weapons or horses. A wise man collects many tools." Despite her desperate situation, Isabella found herself fascinated by this unexpected encounter. The man's presence radiated a competence and confidence that she hadn't encountered since leaving San Antonio. Even exhausted and terrified as she was, she sensed that her circumstances had just changed dramatically. "Who are you?" she managed to ask. "I am called Soaring Eagle among my people," he replied, crouching down to her level but maintaining careful distance. "The question is who you are, and whether you deserve help or punishment." The blunt challenge in his words sparked something in Isabella that exhaustion hadn't quite extinguished. "I am Isabella Rodriguez, and I have done nothing to deserve punishment except trust the wrong man and try to save my family from poverty." Soaring Eagle studied her with those penetrating dark eyes, seeming to weigh her words against some internal standard. After a moment that felt like an eternity, he nodded slightly. "Tell me quickly, the men who pursue you, what do they want?" Isabella's words tumbled out in a desperate rush as she explained her situation. The mail-order bride advertisement, Jeremiah Blackstone's criminal operation, her imprisonment and escape, and the 3 days of flight through the canyons. As she spoke, she watched Soaring Eagle's expression gradually change from neutral assessment to something that might have been recognition. "This Blackstone," he said when she finished, "he is the one they call the Grey Wolf, the man who uses his ranch to hide stolen cattle and murdered travelers." Isabella's blood chilled at this description, though it aligned perfectly with her growing understanding of Blackstone's true nature. "You know him?" "I know of him," Soaring Eagle replied grimly. "His men killed a family of Mormon settlers last spring, parents and 3 children traveling to establish a new farm. They made it look like an Indian attack, but they left sign that told the real story to those who knew how to read it. The revelation that Blackstone's crimes extended to murdering entire families confirmed Isabella's worst fears about what would have happened if she had remained at the ranch. But it also explained the intensity of the current pursuit. Blackstone couldn't afford to let her escape with knowledge of his operations. "He will not stop hunting me," she said, voicing the terrible truth they both understood. As long as I live, I represent a threat to his entire criminal network. Soaring Eagle nodded gravely. This is why you cannot simply hide until he gives up the search. You must disappear completely, or you must ensure that he can no longer pursue you. The implications of his words were clear, and Isabella felt a chill that had nothing to do with the shade of the boulder. You mean kill him? I mean survive, Soaring Eagle corrected. In this country, sometimes those are the same thing. Before Isabella could respond, both of them heard the sound that made her blood freeze, the distant baying of tracking dogs, much closer than before. Blackstone's hunting party had found her trail again and was closing in rapidly. Soaring Eagle was on his feet instantly, his entire demeanor transforming from thoughtful conversation to deadly alertness. "Can you travel?" he asked tersely. Isabella tried to stand, but immediately collapsed as her damaged feet refused to support her weight. The warrior took in her condition with a single glance, then made a decision that would alter both their destinies. I'm going to carry you," he announced, already moving to lift her despite her protests. "There is a place deeper in the canyons where we can make a stand, but we must reach it before they corner us in the open." As Soaring Eagle lifted Isabella, with surprising gentleness, she found herself pressed against the chest of a man who radiated both strength and controlled violence. His movements as he began navigating the treacherous canyon terrain were so fluid and confident that she began to understand how he had survived alone in this harsh wilderness. "Why are you helping me?" she asked as they moved swiftly through passages she would never have noticed on her own. Soaring Eagle was quiet for so long that Isabella thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a pain that made her understand why he had initially seemed so distant. "Because 3 years ago, soldiers hunted my wife and child through different canyons, and no one helped them escape." The simple statement contained volumes of tragedy and explained everything about the scarred warrior who had appeared like an answer to desperate prayer. Isabella felt tears she couldn't afford to shed stinging her eyes as she realized that her rescue had been motivated not by heroic impulses, but by the need to heal an old wound that had never properly closed. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew steadily closer as Blackstone's men followed the trail with deadly persistence. But ahead lay the deeper mysteries of the canyon country, where ancient peoples had once hidden from enemies, and where a Lakota warrior had learned to become invisible to those who sought to destroy him. The mail-order bride and the vengeful warrior were now bound together by circumstances neither had chosen, racing toward a confrontation that would test everything they thought they knew about survival, justice, and the possibility of redemption in a land that offered both breathtaking beauty and sudden death to those who dared to claim it as their own. Deep within the sacred heart of the canyon system, where ancient ancestral Puebloan people had once carved their cliff dwellings into living rock, Soaring Eagle carried Isabella toward a destination that existed in the memories of fewer than a dozen living men. The hidden fortress he sought had been discovered by his grandfather during a vision quest 40 years earlier, a natural stronghold so perfectly concealed that even the U.S. Army's best scouts had never found it during their systematic mapping of the region. The journey tested every ounce of Soaring Eagle's legendary endurance. Isabella, though small in stature, became increasingly heavy as dehydration and exhaustion took their toll on her body. Her breathing grew shallow and irregular, and twice she lost consciousness completely, forcing the warrior to stop and attempt to revive her with precious drops of water from his hidden reserves. Each delay allowed Blackstone's hunting party to gain ground, and the sound of barking dogs now echoed constantly through the twisted passages behind them. But Soaring Eagle had advantages that no white tracker could match. His knowledge of these canyons went beyond mere familiarity. It was an intimate understanding passed down through generations of indigenous peoples who had used these formations for shelter, ceremony, and warfare. He knew which seemingly solid rock faces were actually thin shells that could be pushed aside to reveal hidden passages. He recognized the subtle signs that indicated underground water sources and the natural chimneys that could confuse tracking dogs with conflicting scent trails. Most importantly, he understood the psychological warfare that the canyons themselves could wage against intruders. The towering walls of red sandstone seemed to shift and change as the sun moved across the sky, creating optical illusions that could drive experienced outdoorsmen to panic. Echoes bounced in unexpected directions, making it impossible to determine the true location of sounds. And the maze-like nature of the passages meant that a single wrong turn could lead to dead ends or treacherous drops that were invisible until the last fatal step. As they penetrated deeper into the geological labyrinth, Isabella began to emerge. From her state of near unconsciousness, the first thing she noticed was that the quality of light around them had changed dramatically. Instead of the harsh, direct sunlight that had been beating down on the open canyon floors, they were now moving through a world of reflected illumination, golden light that bounced off curved rock walls to create an almost underwater effect. "Where are we?" she whispered, her voice barely audible but carrying clearly in the acoustic chamber created by the surrounding stone. "A place that has no name in any white man's language," Soaring Eagle replied softly. "My grandfather called it the Heart of Stone, but even that is only an approximation. Some places are too sacred for ordinary words." Isabella found herself gazing upward at rock formations that defied easy description. The walls rose hundreds of feet above them, carved into impossible spirals and arches by millions of years of wind and water. But what struck her most powerfully was the silence, not the empty silence of a dead place, but the profound quiet of somewhere that had witnessed countless human dramas and absorbed them all into its eternal patience. "How do you know about this place?" she asked, genuinely curious despite their desperate circumstances. Soaring Eagle's pace never slowed as he answered, but Isabella could hear a reverence in his voice that hadn't been present before. "When I was 16 winters old, my grandfather brought me here during my vision quest. For 4 days and 4 nights, I fasted and prayed in a cave near the sacred spring, waiting for the spirits to show me my path in life." Isabella waited for him to continue, sensing that this story was important to understanding the man who was risking his life to save hers. "On the 3rd night, I saw a vision of great destruction coming to my people. Soldiers with long knives, tribes scattered like leaves in winter wind, children crying for parents who would never return. But I also saw that some would survive by learning to move like shadows through places the white man could never find or understand." The prophecy had proven tragically accurate. Soaring Eagle's band had been among those scattered by the armies. Relentless campaign to force all Indians onto reservations. But his grandfather's teachings about hidden sanctuaries had indeed kept him alive when conventional warfare would have meant certain death. As they rounded a particularly sharp turn in the passage, Isabella gasped at the sight that opened before them. They had emerged into a vast natural amphitheater, perhaps 200 feet across, enclosed by walls that rose nearly vertically for over 300 feet. At the center of this cathedral-like space, a clear spring bubbled up from deep underground, creating a small pool that reflected the narrow strip of sky visible far above. But what made Isabella's breath catch were the human modifications to this natural sanctuary. Along the walls, carved into the living rock, were dozens of rooms and storage chambers created by the ancient cliff dwellers. Wooden ladders, obviously much more recent than the original construction, provided access to different levels, and scattered throughout the space were clear signs of recent habitation, fire rings, carefully organized supplies, and weapons stored in strategic locations. "You live here," Isabella realized, understanding dawning in her voice. "When I need to disappear completely," Soaring Eagle confirmed, finally setting her down beside the spring. "This is my fortress, my sanctuary, and if necessary, my tomb." The last words carried an ominous weight that Isabella couldn't ignore. "What do you mean, your tomb?" Soaring Eagle was already moving with purposeful efficiency, checking weapons, caches, and examining sightlines that commanded the narrow entrance through which they had arrived. "There is only one way in or out of this place. If Blackstone's men find the entrance, we will have the advantage of high ground and prepared positions. But if we cannot drive them away," he shrugged with grim acceptance, "then we will die here, but we will take many of them with us." Isabella felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cool air rising from the spring. She had escaped Blackstone's ranch hoping to find safety, but instead she had led danger directly to the one place her rescuer considered sacred. The guilt was almost overwhelming. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I never meant to bring this trouble to your sanctuary." Soaring Eagle paused in his preparations to look at her directly. "Do not apologize for fighting to survive. My grandfather taught me that all living things have the right to defend themselves, and that anyone who helps in that defense honors the Creator's plan." His words carried a conviction that helped ease Isabella's guilt, but she could see the pain in his eyes as he prepared to potentially defend his sacred refuge with violence. This place clearly meant more to him than mere shelter. It was his connection to family, tradition, and spiritual beliefs that the outside world had tried to destroy. As if reading her thoughts, Soaring Eagle began sharing more about the hidden fortress while he worked. The cliff dwellings had been abandoned for centuries when his grandfather first discovered them, but they showed clear signs of having been used intermittently by various indigenous groups seeking refuge from enemies. Some of the modifications were clearly very old, while others were recent enough to have been made by Soaring Eagle himself during his 3 years of exile. "I have spent many seasons here," he explained, while checking the mechanisms of a rifle he produced from a concealed cache. "Learning the old ways that the reservation schools tried to beat out of us, practicing skills my grandfather passed down in secret, preparing for the day when I would either find peace or die fighting for something worth defending." Isabella watched him work with growing admiration. Every movement was economical and purposeful, revealing a competence born of hard experience. He wasn't just a warrior, he was a survivor who had adapted ancient knowledge to modern threats with deadly effectiveness. But the most remarkable thing about Soaring Eagle, Isabella realized, was his fundamental humanity, despite everything he had endured. He could have left her to die in the desert, eliminating any connection to his hidden sanctuary. Instead, he had chosen to risk everything he had built to save a stranger whose only claim on his help was shared suffering. "Why did you really save me?" she asked suddenly, needing to understand the man who had become her unlikely protector. Soaring Eagle stopped his preparations and was quiet for a long moment, staring up at the narrow strip of sky visible above their sanctuary. When he finally spoke, his voice carried depths of pain and hope that Isabella was only beginning to comprehend. "Because Morning Dove, my wife, had eyes like yours, not the same color, but the same fire. She refused to accept defeat even when the soldiers were burning our lodge around her. She died fighting to protect our son, never giving up hope that somehow they might survive." Isabella felt tears sting her eyes as she began to understand the profound gift Soaring Eagle was offering her. By saving her life, he was honoring the memory of the family he had failed to protect. Her survival had become, in some way, his redemption. "She would be proud of what you're doing." Isabella said. Softly, perhaps, Soaring Eagle replied. Or perhaps she would say I am being foolish to risk the sacred place for someone I barely know. The dead do not speak clearly to the living. Before Isabella could respond, both of them heard the sound that chilled their blood. Voices echoing. From the passage through which they had entered, Blackstone's men had found the entrance to the heart of stone. Soaring Eagle's transformation was instantaneous and complete. The thoughtful man sharing memories of his dead family vanished, replaced by a warrior whose every instinct was focused on survival and victory. He moved with fluid grace to positions. He had obviously prepared long ago, gesturing for Isabella to take cover behind rocks that would protect her from gunfire while still allowing her to observe the coming battle. "How many men does Blackstone have?" he asked tersely, his voice now carrying the cold efficiency of a military commander. "I counted at least 8 when they were searching the ranch," Isabella replied, forcing herself to think clearly despite her fear. "But he might have called in additional help for this hunt." Soaring Eagle nodded grimly. 8 men with rifles, in a confined space, fighting uphill against prepared positions. The odds are not impossible, but they are not good. As the voices grew closer, Isabella could make out individual words, Blackstone's cultured tones giving orders, the rougher voices of his hired killers responding with eager anticipation of violence. They were discussing how to approach the hidden sanctuary, clearly aware that they were entering a potential trap, but confident in their superior numbers. "Listen to me carefully," Soaring Eagle said urgently, pressing a small but deadly-looking knife into Isabella's hand. "If they break through my positions, do not let them take you alive. Blackstone will make you suffer in ways that will make death seem like mercy." Isabella's hand trembled as she accepted the weapon, understanding exactly what he was asking her to do if their defense failed. But looking into his scarred face, seeing the absolute determination there, she found her own courage strengthening. "It won't come to that," she said with more confidence than she felt. "You're fighting on your own ground, in a place that gives you every advantage. They're the ones walking into a trap." Soaring Eagle smiled for the first time since she had met him, and Isabella caught a glimpse of the man he might have been in a different life, someone capable of joy and hope rather than just survival and vengeance. "You have warrior's blood," he said approvingly. "Good. We will need all the warrior's blood we can find in the next hour." The sound of approaching footsteps grew louder, accompanied by the nervous whining of tracking dogs who clearly didn't like the confined space and strange acoustics of the ancient sanctuary. Blackstone's hunting party was about to discover that their easy pursuit had led them into the most dangerous few minutes of their criminal careers. High above in the cliff-dwelling alcoves, Soaring Eagle checked his weapons one final time and prepared to defend not just his sacred refuge, but the woman whose courage had reminded him that some things were still worth fighting for. The mail-order bride and the exiled warrior were about to face their greatest test together, in a battle that would determine whether justice or brutality would triumph in the heart of stone. The first gunshot shattered the ancient silence of the heart of stone like a thunderclap, its echo bouncing off the curved walls in a cacophony that seemed to go on forever. Jeremiah Blackstone had sent his most expendable man, a vicious drifter named Pike, to test the entrance to the hidden sanctuary. Pike's scream cut short as Soaring Eagle's rifle bullet found its mark with surgical precision. But the message was clear. The sanctuary's defender was not only armed, but deadly accurate. From his concealed position among the cliff dwellings, Soaring Eagle could see everything unfolding in the narrow entrance passage. Blackstone had positioned his men with the tactical sense of someone who understood warfare, but they were fighting in an environment unlike anything they had ever encountered. The acoustic properties of the stone amphitheater turned every whisper. into audible intelligence, while the complex shadows and reflected light created optical illusions that made accurate shooting nearly impossible for attackers unfamiliar with the space. "He's up in those Indian ruins," shouted Burke, Blackstone's massive second-in-command, pointing toward the cliff dwellings where muzzle flash had briefly revealed Soaring Eagle's position. "We can smoke him out with fire." But Blackstone, for all his cruelty, was not a fool. He had survived years of criminal activity by thinking strategically, rather than simply relying on brute force. "Those ruins are stone, you idiot," he snapped at Burke. "Fire won't burn stone. And I want the woman alive, remember? Start burning things in a confined space like this, and we'll kill her along with our Indian friend." Isabella, crouched behind carefully positioned boulders near the sacred spring, listened to the exchange with growing understanding of the tactical situation. Blackstone's desire to capture her alive was both a protection and a vulnerability. It limited his men's options, while giving Soaring Eagle additional advantages. But she also realized that her presence was forcing the warrior to fight a defensive battle when his skills might be better suited to guerrilla tactics. The second assault came from multiple directions as Blackstone's men tried to use their superior numbers to overwhelm the sanctuary's single defender. 3 men rushed the entrance simultaneously, while 2 others attempted to climb the outer walls of the amphitheater, hoping to gain access to the cliff dwellings from above. Soaring Eagle had anticipated exactly this strategy. His 3 years of exile had been spent not just surviving, but learning to fight like his ancestors, who had once defended these same cliffs against Navajo raiders and Spanish conquistadors. Every position he had prepared served multiple purposes, and every weapon cache was positioned to cover specific fields of fire that turned the sanctuary's geography into a deadly maze for intruders. The wall climbers never had a chance. Soaring Eagle had prepared carefully weighted stones that could be rolled from the cliff-dwelling openings with devastating effect. The first climber, a lean man called Rawhide Pete, was crushed against the rock face by a boulder that struck him with enough force to shatter bones. His screams echoed through the chamber as he fell nearly 200 feet to the stone floor below. The second climber, seeing his companion's fate, tried to retreat, but found that descending the vertical rock face was far more difficult than climbing it had been. Soaring Eagle's second prepared stone caught him in the shoulder, spinning him away from the wall to join his partner in death on the canyon floor. Meanwhile, the 3 men rushing the entrance passage encountered a different kind of hell. Soaring Eagle had used his intimate knowledge of the sanctuary's acoustics to position himself where he could hear their approach long before they could see him. His first shot took down the leader, a scarred gunfighter named Valdez, with a bullet through the heart. The second shot wounded another man in the leg, sending him sprawling and blocking the narrow passage for his companions. But the third attacker, a young desperado eager to prove himself to Blackstone, managed to reach the main chamber of the sanctuary. For the first time, Isabella found herself directly threatened by one of her pursuers, as the gunman stumbled into the amphitheater with his weapon raised and murder in his eyes. "There's the little bride," he shouted triumphantly, raising his pistol toward Isabella's hiding place. "Come on out, pretty lady, or I'll come in there and drag you out." What the desperado hadn't anticipated was that Isabella Rodriguez was not the helpless victim he expected. Her 3 days of flight through the canyons, combined with the warrior training she had absorbed from watching Soaring Eagle, had awakened something fierce and determined in her character. When the gunman approached her position, Isabella was ready with the knife Soaring Eagle had given her. The desperado's mistake was assuming that a woman would cower rather than fight. When he reached around the boulder to grab Isabella, she struck with the precision of someone fighting for her life. The blade found the soft tissue just below his ribs, angled upward to reach vital organs, just as Soaring Eagle had quickly instructed her during their preparation. The man's expression of cruel anticipation changed to shocked disbelief as he realized that his intended victim had become his killer. He staggered backward, clutching at the wound, before collapsing beside the sacred spring that had sustained life in this place for countless generations. Isabella stared at the dying man with a mixture of horror and grim satisfaction. She had never killed anyone before, never even imagined herself capable of such violence. But the woman who had answered Jeremiah Blackstone's mail-order bride advertisement was gone forever, replaced by someone harder and more dangerous, someone who would do whatever was necessary to survive. From his elevated position, Soaring Eagle witnessed Isabella's transformation with approval and recognition. The woman he had rescued was becoming a true warrior, someone who could not only survive in this harsh country, but protect others who might need help. The parallel to his own wife's final battle was both painful and inspiring, but the immediate tactical situation was far from resolved. Blackstone still had at least 4 men alive, and the rancher himself had not yet entered the fight directly. Through the acoustic properties of the sanctuary, Soaring Eagle could hear the criminal leader reorganizing his remaining forces for what would clearly be a final, desperate assault. "Listen carefully," Blackstone's voice carried clearly through the stone chamber. "The Indian's got the high ground, but he's only one man. We rush him from 3 directions at once. He can't shoot all of us. Jenkins, you and Murphy go left. Carson, you're with me, straight up the middle. When we get close enough, we use grenades." The mention of explosives changed everything. Soaring Eagle had fought against cavalry units that used dynamite to collapse cave hideouts, and he understood the devastating effectiveness of such weapons in confined spaces. Even if the explosions didn't kill him and Isabella directly, they could bring down enough of the cliff-dwelling structure to trap them permanently in the sanctuary, making a decision that went against every tactical instinct he had developed. During 3 years of guerrilla warfare, Soaring Eagle abandoned his prepared positions and moved to ground level. If Blackstone's men were going to use explosives, the high ground advantage would become a death trap. Better to fight on equal terms than to be buried alive in the ancient ruins. Isabella saw the warrior dropping down from the cliff dwellings. With fluid grace, his weapons ready and his scarred face set in lines of deadly determination. When he reached her position beside the spring, she could see that he had made a fundamental change in strategy. "They have explosives," he said tersely. "We cannot defend from above anymore. Now we fight like cornered wolves, together, back to back, until either they are all dead or we are." The final assault began with Blackstone's remaining men advancing from multiple directions, their confidence boosted by superior numbers and firepower. But what they encountered was not a desperate last stand by overwhelmed defenders, but a coordinated counterattack by 2 people who had found something worth dying for in each other's survival. Soaring Eagle moved with the fluid deadliness of a predator in his element, using every piece of cover the sanctuary provided while maintaining constant communication with Isabella. His rifle shots were precisely placed, conserving ammunition while ensuring that each bullet either killed or disabled an attacker. When the range closed too much for effective rifle work, he switched to the war club his grandfather had made, wielding it with devastating efficiency against men who had never faced a warrior trained in close combat. Isabella proved to be more than just a survivor. She had become a genuine combat partner. Her knowledge of Blackstone's men, combined with her natural intelligence and desperate courage, made her an effective spotter and tactical advisor. When Jenkins tried to flank Soaring Eagle's position, Isabella's warning shot with a pistol she had taken from the dead desperado forced him back into the warrior's field of fire. The battle reached its climax when Jeremiah Blackstone himself finally entered the sanctuary, carrying a stick of dynamite with a lit fuse. His cultured facade had completely disappeared, replaced by the snarling desperation of a cornered animal who realized that his entire criminal empire was collapsing around him. "Enough!" he screamed, holding the explosive device above his head. "I'll bring this whole place down rather than let you escape. You've cost me everything, my reputation, my operations, my men." But Blackstone had made the same mistake as his subordinates. He had underestimated both the tactical situation and the people he was fighting. Soaring Eagle had been waiting for exactly this moment, positioning himself for a shot that would require every skill his grandfather had taught him about combat marksmanship. The rifle bullet struck the dynamite stick just as Blackstone was preparing to throw it toward the cliff dwellings. The explosion that followed was contained to the narrow entrance passage, bringing down enough rock to seal the sanctuary's only exit, while eliminating the last of Isabella's pursuers in a roar of fire and stone that seemed to shake the very foundations of the ancient refuge. In the sudden silence that followed, Isabella and Soaring Eagle found themselves alone in the heart of stone, surrounded by the bodies of their enemies, but facing a new and potentially fatal problem. The explosion that had saved them from Blackstone's final assault had also trapped them permanently in the sanctuary that had become their fortress. As dust settled and the reality of their situation became clear, Isabella looked at the man who had risked everything to save her life. They had won the battle, but at a cost that might prove even more devastating than defeat. The sacred spring would sustain them for a while, but without access to the outside world, their victory might simply mean a slower and more lingering death than their enemies had planned for them. The mail-order bride who had become a warrior and the exiled Lakota who had found redemption in protecting her now faced their greatest challenge, not fighting for survival, but living with the consequences of the choices that survival had required. The silence that followed the explosive collapse of the sanctuary's entrance was more profound than any sound Isabella had ever experienced. Even the constant whisper of wind through the canyon passages had been cut off by the tons of sandstone that now sealed the heart of stone as completely as a tomb. In the eerie stillness, the gentle bubbling of the sacred spring seemed as loud as thunder, while the distant cry of a circling hawk served as a mocking reminder of the freedom that lay beyond their reach. Soaring Eagle stood motionless beside the rubble-choked entrance, his scarred face revealing nothing of the calculations racing through his mind. Isabella watched him with growing anxiety, realizing that their moment of triumph over Blackstone had created a problem that might prove even more deadly than their original pursuers. They had food for perhaps a week, water indefinitely from the spring, but no apparent way to escape their stone prison before starvation claimed them both. "How long do we have?" Isabella asked, breaking the oppressive silence with words that seemed to echo endlessly in the enclosed space. Soaring Eagle turned toward her, and for the first time since she had met him, Isabella saw something approaching uncertainty in his dark eyes. "The entrance passage is completely blocked," he said with characteristic directness. "It would take 20 men with proper tools a month to clear that rockfall, assuming they knew where to dig." Isabella felt her heart sink as the full implications of their situation became clear. They had survived Blackstone's assault only to face a slower death by starvation in the most beautiful prison imaginable. But as despair began to settle over her like a suffocating blanket, she noticed that Soaring Eagle's expression was changing, from uncertainty to something that might have been hope. "But," he continued, moving toward one of the ancient cliff-dwelling chambers with sudden purposefulness, "my grandfather told me stories about this place that I had thought were merely legends. Stories about the old ones who built these rooms and how they survived when enemies tried to trap them in their cliff cities." Isabella followed him as he began examining the rear wall of the largest dwelling chamber with intense concentration. His hands moved across the seemingly solid stone surface with the delicate touch of someone reading Braille, searching for irregularities that might reveal secrets hidden for centuries. The ancestral Puebloans were master builders, Soaring Eagle explained as he worked, his voice taking on the reverent tone he used when speaking of sacred matters. But they were also survivors who understood that any fortress must have a secret, way out, known only to those who built it. After several minutes of methodical exploration, Soaring Eagle's fingers found what they were seeking, a section of wall where the ancient mortar had been carefully designed to be removable. Working with patient precision, he began clearing away the carefully fitted stones that concealed what appeared to be the entrance to a narrow tunnel. "I thought this was just another storage chamber," he muttered as the opening gradually revealed itself. "But look, this passage slopes upward, not down. It's not meant for storing grain or water. It's an escape route." Isabella peered into the dark opening with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. The tunnel was barely wide enough for a single person to crawl through, and its destination was completely unknown. But the alternative was certain death in their beautiful prison, and she had not survived everything they had endured together to give up now. "Where does it lead?" she asked, though she suspected Soaring Eagle had no more idea than she did. "Unknown," he admitted with characteristic honesty. But the old ones were not fools. If they built a secret exit, it would emerge somewhere defensible but hidden, probably far from the main entrance to avoid discovery by enemies. The decision to attempt the unknown passage required courage that went beyond anything Isabella had previously demonstrated. The tunnel represented a leap of faith based on nothing more than ancient engineering wisdom and Soaring Eagle's interpretation of his grandfather's stories. But looking around the sanctuary that had become their tomb, Isabella realized they had no choice but to trust in the survival instincts of people who had thrived in this harsh landscape for thousands of years. "What do we take with us?" she asked, already beginning to gather their essential supplies. Soaring Eagle was filling water containers and selecting weapons with the methodical efficiency of someone who had made such preparations many times before. "Water, food for 3. Days, weapons, fire-making materials, everything else stays here. The passage is too narrow for excess baggage." As they prepared for their desperate escape attempt, Isabella found herself studying the man who had become the center of her transformed existence. 3 days ago, she had been a terrified bride fleeing through the desert with no skills beyond basic needlework and household management. Now she was preparing to crawl through an ancient tunnel system with a Lakota warrior, carrying weapons she had used to kill enemies, planning survival strategies that would have been incomprehensible to her former self. But the most remarkable change was not in her practical abilities. It was in her fundamental understanding of what it meant to be truly alive, living with constant danger, fighting for survival alongside someone who had risked everything to protect her, had awakened aspects of her character that comfortable civilization had never revealed. She was discovering that Isabella Rodriguez contained depths of courage, resourcefulness, and fierce loyalty that her sheltered upbringing had never allowed to surface. "Ready?" Soaring Eagle asked, adjusting the pack that contained their survival supplies. Isabella took one last look around the heart of stone, fixing in her memory the sacred space where she had been transformed from victim to warrior. Whatever lay ahead in the ancient tunnel system, she knew she would never again be the frightened woman who had answered Jeremiah Blackstone's advertisement. "Ready," she confirmed, and meant it completely. The tunnel proved to be a masterpiece of ancient engineering, carved through solid sandstone with tools that modern miners would have envied. The passage was barely large enough for them to crawl through single file, but it had been designed with subtle features that made the journey possible. carefully placed air shafts that provided ventilation, slight variations in width that allowed for occasional rest stops, and a gentle but consistent upward slope that promised eventual emergence into daylight. Soaring Eagle led the way, his warrior instincts adapted to this new form of battlefield navigation. Every few yards, he would stop to listen for sounds that might indicate danger ahead, testing air currents that could reveal information about the tunnel's destination, feeling for structural weaknesses that might threaten collapse. His grandfather's training in reading natural signs proved as valuable in this underground environment as it had been in the open canyons. Behind him, Isabella discovered that her seamstress training had given her unexpected advantages in the confined space. Years of working with delicate materials had developed her manual dexterity and spatial awareness to levels that served her well in navigating the narrow passage. More importantly, her experience with detailed patient work had prepared her mentally for the claustrophobic journey that might have driven less disciplined people to panic. As they progressed through the tunnel system, it became clear that the ancient builders had created something far more sophisticated than a simple escape route. Side passages branched off at regular intervals, some leading to storage chambers still containing pottery and preserved food, others opening into natural caverns that had been modified to serve as temporary shelters. The entire complex represented an underground city designed to sustain a considerable population during extended sieges. How did they manage all this without metal tools? Isabella whispered during one of their rest stops, her voice barely audible in the confined space. Stone tools, patience, and knowledge passed down through generations, Soaring Eagle replied, softly. They understood this rock like I understand the behavior of horses or the flight patterns of eagles. Every cut, every angle, every structural decision was based on wisdom that took centuries to accumulate. The respect in his voice reminded Isabella of how he spoke about his own grandfather's teachings. She was beginning to understand that Soaring Eagle saw clear parallels between his own people's ancient wisdom and the engineering marvels they were crawling through. Both represented indigenous knowledge systems that had been dismissed or destroyed by advancing European civilization, but which contained insights that modern technology could barely match. After what felt like hours of careful progress through the tunnel system, Isabella began to notice changes that suggested they were approaching their destination. The air was moving more freely, carrying scents of sage and pine that spoke of the outside world. The passage was gradually widening, and ahead of them, Soaring Eagle had stopped moving entirely. Light, he whispered, the single word carrying more hope than Isabella had heard in his voice since their first meeting. Moving forward to join him, Isabella saw what had captured his attention. A faint glow coming from somewhere ahead. Too steady to be artificial light, but too bright to be reflected starlight. They were approaching an exit that would emerge during daylight hours, but the nature of that exit remained unknown. The final section of the tunnel required them to climb rather than crawl, following hand and footholds carved into the rock walls by the ancient builders. As they ascended toward the growing light, Isabella could hear sounds that made her heart leap, wind moving through pine trees, the cry of hunting hawks, the distant sound of running water that meant they were approaching a completely different section of the canyon system. When Soaring Eagle finally emerged from the tunnel opening, Isabella heard his sharp intake of breath and knew they had reached something remarkable. Following him into the daylight, she found herself standing on a narrow ledge that overlooked a hidden valley she never could have imagined. The valley was perhaps a mile long and half as wide, completely enclosed by towering sandstone walls that would have made it invisible from any external vantage point. A substantial stream ran down its center, fed by springs that emerged from the rock walls at several points. The floor was covered with rich grass and scattered groves of cottonwood and pine trees that created a landscape more like a park than a wilderness refuge. But what made Isabella gasp with amazement were the signs of current habitation scattered. Throughout the valley, she could see cultivated fields, well-maintained buildings that combined traditional Indian construction with practical frontier modifications, and people moving about their daily activities with the comfortable rhythm of an established community. "What is this place?" she breathed, hardly believing what her eyes were showing her. Soaring Eagle was staring at the scene below with an expression that combined surprise, recognition, and something that might have been profound relief. "This is where they went," he said quietly, his voice filled with wonder. "The people who refused the reservations, who disappeared into the canyons rather than submit to the white man's rules. They found the old one's hidden valley and made it their own." As they stood on the ledge overlooking this secret sanctuary, Isabella began to understand the full significance of their discovery. They had not simply escaped from their stone prison. They had found a community of survivors who had chosen freedom over security, hardship over submission, traditional ways over imposed civilization. Movement below indicated that their emergence had been noticed. People were pointing in their direction, and several figures were beginning to climb the switchbacking trail that connected the valley floor to the ledge where they stood. Isabella felt a moment of uncertainty. Were these people friends or potential enemies? How would they react to the arrival of a Mexican woman and a Lakota warrior who had brought violence to the sacred canyons? But Soaring Eagle's expression was transforming into something Isabella had never seen before. Not just hope, but actual joy. "I recognize some of them," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "That tall man climbing toward us, that standing bear from my grandfather's band, and the woman beside him, she was at the mission school with my sister." The realization that they were approaching not strangers, but people connected to Soaring Eagle's past, added new dimensions to their situation that Isabella was only beginning to comprehend. Their desperate escape from Blackstone's trap had led them not just to safety, but to the possibility of belonging somewhere, something neither of them had experienced for years. As the climbing figures drew closer, Isabella could see that they were indeed approaching with welcome rather than suspicion. The man Soaring Eagle had identified as Standing Bear was smiling broadly, calling out greetings in Lakota that obviously carried news of their survival to the rest of the community below. But Isabella also realized that her own situation was about to become more complex than simple survival. She was approaching a community that had rejected white civilization entirely, as a woman whose background and experiences were completely different from anyone they had ever encountered. How would these people react to a Mexican mail-order bride who had killed men in combat and learned warfare from one of their own? The answer came when Standing Bear reached their ledge and embraced Soaring Eagle with obvious joy, then turned to Isabella with eyes that held no judgment, only curiosity and welcome. "Any woman who fights beside Soaring Eagle and survives the Heart of Stone is welcome among the people," he said in careful English, extending his hand to her with formal courtesy. "Come down to the village. There are many stories to share and much to learn about the new life you have chosen." As they began the descent into the hidden valley, Isabella realized that her transformation was far from complete. She had evolved from frightened bride to desert survivor to combat warrior. But now she was about to discover what it meant to become part of a community that existed entirely outside the world she had always known. The mail-order bride who had fled Jeremiah Blackstone's ranch was gone forever, replaced by someone harder, braver, and more capable than she had ever imagined possible. But the woman she was becoming Isabella of the Hidden Valley, partner to a Lakota warrior, member of a community that had chosen freedom over safety, was still being born, with each step down the ancient trail toward her new home. 6 months. After her desperate flight through the Utah canyons, Isabella Rodriguez stood at the edge of the Hidden Valley's central stream, teaching a group of Paiute and Navajo children how to embroider traditional Mexican patterns onto buckskin clothing. The morning sun caught the intricate silver threads she had learned to make from melted coins and jewelry, creating designs that blended her San Antonio heritage with the geometric patterns favored by the canyon's indigenous residents. Around her, the sounds of a thriving community filled the air. Women grinding corn with ancient metats, men working leather and wood with tools that combined traditional techniques with innovations born of necessity, children speaking a mixture of tribal languages that had evolved into their own unique dialect. The transformation of the Hidden Valley since Isabella and Soaring Eagle's arrival had been remarkable, but not in ways that either of them had initially expected. Rather than simply joining an existing community, they had become catalysts for changes that were reshaping how the canyon refugees understood their relationship with the outside world and their own cultural identity. Isabella's skills as a seamstress had proven invaluable, but not in the traditional sense. Her knowledge of European clothing construction, combined with access to materials obtained through carefully planned trading expeditions, had enabled the valley's residents to create garments that would allow them to move undetected through white settlements when necessary. The community's policy of complete isolation was gradually giving way to selective engagement with the outside world, based on intelligence gathering and strategic resource acquisition that Isabella's urban background made possible. More significantly, her experience with Blackstone's criminal network had provided the community with crucial insights into the threats they faced from white expansion. During long evening councils held around the central fire, Isabella had shared detailed knowledge about how land grabbers, cattle rustlers, and corrupt territorial officials operated, information that had already prevented several attempts to discover and exploit the Hidden Valley. But the most profound changes had occurred in the relationship between Isabella and Soaring Eagle themselves. The desperate alliance forged during their flight from Blackstone had evolved into something deeper and more complex, a partnership that transcended the simple categories of romance or friendship that Isabella's previous experience had provided. They had become something new, two people who had found in each other not just survival, but the possibility of creating meaning from trauma. Standing Bear, who had emerged as the valley's informal leader, approached Isabella as she finished the morning's lesson. At 63, he carried the dignity of someone who had lived through the worst of the Indian Wars, while maintaining his commitment to traditional values. His acceptance of Isabella had been crucial to her integration into the community, and his wisdom had guided the valley's adaptation to the challenges that her arrival had highlighted. "The council wishes to speak with you and Soaring Eagle tonight," he said, in the careful English he used for formal occasions. "There are decisions to be made about the future, and your voices are needed." Isabella nodded respectfully, understanding that her status in the community had evolved far beyond that of a refugee seeking shelter. Over the past months, she had become what the people called a bridge walker, someone who could move between worlds while maintaining loyalty to the community that had given her sanctuary. The evening council meeting took place in the valley's largest kiva, a circular ceremonial chamber that the residents had carved into the sandstone cliffs using techniques learned from studying the ancient ruins scattered throughout the canyon system. Representatives from all of the valley's constituent groups were present: Lakota, Paiute, Navajo, and even a few white settlers who had chosen exile over compliance with territorial authorities that they considered corrupt. The discussion that followed was conducted in multiple languages, with frequent translations that reflected the community's commitment to ensuring that everyone could participate in decisions that affected their collective future. But the central issue was clear. The Hidden Valley could no longer remain completely isolated from the rapidly changing world beyond the canyon walls. A Navajo elder named Many Horses spoke first, his weathered hands tracing patterns in the sand as he outlined the strategic situation. The railroad brings more whites every season. The territorial government sends surveyors deeper into the canyons each year. Soon, no place will be hidden enough to escape their maps and their hunger for land. Standing Bear nodded gravely. We have lived like ghosts for 5 years, taking only what we needed, leaving no sign of our presence. But Isabella's knowledge shows us that hiding is not enough. We must be prepared to defend ourselves or find new ways to protect what we have built here. Soaring Eagle, who had been listening intently, finally spoke with the authority of someone whose voice carried weight in the council. There is a third path, one that Isabella and I have discussed during our scouting expeditions. We could become known to the outside world, but on our own terms. The suggestion caused a stir throughout the gathered council members. The idea of voluntary contact with white civilization challenged everything the valley's residents had believed about survival in a hostile world. Isabella rose to speak, feeling the weight of responsibility that came with her unique position. As both insider and outsider in this community, in San Antonio, I knew Mexican families who preserved their traditions while adapting to American rule. They succeeded not by hiding, but by becoming too valuable to destroy. We could do the same here, become known as peaceful traders and crafters rather than hiding like fugitives. The debate that followed lasted well into the night, touching on fundamental questions about identity, survival, and the meaning of freedom. That had no easy answers. Some community members argued for maintaining complete isolation, viewing any contact with white civilization as inherently corrupting. Others supported Isabella's proposal, seeing it as a way to gain legal protection and economic opportunities that hiding could never provide. But the most compelling argument came from an unexpected source. Little Moon, a 12-year-old Paiute, girl who had been born in the valley and knew no other home. My grandmother tells stories about the time before, when our people traded with everyone, Mexicans, whites, other tribes. She says we were stronger then because we knew many ways of living. Maybe we can learn to be strong like that again. The child's words carried a wisdom that transcended the strategic calculations that had dominated the discussion. Here was someone who represented the valley's future, arguing for engagement rather than isolation, based not on fear, but on confidence in her community's ability to adapt while preserving what mattered most. In the end, the council reached a consensus that reflected the community's pragmatic approach to survival. They would attempt Isabella's strategy of controlled engagement, but with careful safeguards and the ability to retreat to complete isolation if the experiment proved dangerous. The implementation of this decision became Isabella's primary responsibility over the following months. Using her knowledge of territorial politics and business practices, she established the valley's residents as the Canyon Cooperative, a trading partnership that specialized in high-quality leather goods, woven textiles, and traditional crafts that commanded premium prices in the growing frontier towns. The key to the strategy's success was maintaining strict control over what outsiders knew about the valley and its residents. Trading expeditions were conducted by small groups who posed as itinerant crafters from various tribal backgrounds, never revealing the existence of their permanent settlement. Profits from these ventures were used to purchase legal documentation, establish banking relationships, and even acquire formal title to lands that included parts of the Hidden Valley. Most importantly, Isabella used her growing network of contacts to gather intelligence about territorial developments that might threaten the community. Her transformation from mail-order bride to reconnaissance specialist was perhaps the most remarkable aspect of her evolution. But it built naturally on skills she had developed during her flight from Blackstone: the ability to read people's intentions, gather information through casual conversation, and maintain cover identities that concealed her true purposes. The success of the Canyon Cooperative's trading operations had effects that extended far beyond simple economic benefit. As the valley's residents gained experience dealing with the outside world on their own terms, their confidence and cohesion as a community strengthened rather than weakened. They were proving to themselves that they could engage with white civilization without being destroyed by it, a lesson that had profound implications for indigenous resistance throughout the territory. But the most significant change was in Isabella herself. Over the course of a year in the Hidden Valley, she had evolved from a desperate refugee into someone who commanded respect and authority in a community that valued competence and wisdom above social convention. Her relationship with Soaring Eagle had deepened into a partnership that served as a model for others in the valley. Two people from completely different backgrounds who had found ways to honor both their individual heritage and their shared commitment to the community's welfare. The formal recognition of their bond came during the valley's celebration of the spring equinox, when Soaring Eagle and Isabella exchanged vows in a ceremony that blended Lakota traditions with elements from Isabella's Mexican Catholic background. Standing Bear officiated, speaking in 3 languages to ensure that everyone present could understand the significance of the moment. "These two people have walked through fire together," he said, his voice carrying across the gathered community. "They have fought enemies, survived hardship, and chosen to build something new rather than merely escaping from something old. Their union represents what we all hope to achieve: the creation of family and meaning from the materials that life provides, regardless of how different those materials might seem." As Isabella and Soaring Eagle sealed their commitment with the exchange of gifts, she offering him a silver medallion bearing both Christian and indigenous symbols, he presenting her with eagle feathers that represented his acceptance of her. Into his spiritual as well as personal life, the assembled community understood that they were witnessing more than a wedding. They were seeing the emergence of something entirely new, a way of being indigenous that incorporated adaptation without surrender, engagement without assimilation. The years that followed saw the Canyon Cooperative evolve into something approaching, a small but legitimate business enterprise that provided cover for the valley's continued existence as an autonomous community. Isabella became known throughout the territory as a skilled trader and craftswoman whose connections extended from Denver to Santa Fe, while Soaring Eagle's reputation as a guide and scout made him valuable to explorers and scientists who were mapping the canyon country's geological wonders. Their success created opportunities for other valley residents to engage with the outside world on their own terms. Young people who had been raised in hiding began traveling to frontier towns for education or trade apprenticeships, always returning with new skills and knowledge that strengthened the community. Elders who had preserved traditional knowledge found eager audiences among anthropologists and artists who were beginning to appreciate indigenous wisdom traditions. But perhaps the most important development was the gradual emergence of the Hidden Valley as a refuge for others who found themselves displaced by the rapid changes transforming the American West. Mixed-blood families who faced discrimination in both white and tribal communities, former slaves seeking genuine freedom in the territories, Even white settlers, who had grown disillusioned with the violence and corruption that characterized much of frontier expansion, all found welcome in a community that judged people by their contributions rather than their origins. As Isabella stood once again at the edge of the central stream on a morning 5 years after her arrival in the valley, she reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this moment. The woman who had answered Jeremiah Blackstone's mail-order bride advertisement was so completely gone that she seemed like a character from someone else's story. In her place was Isabella Takes Horse, the name she had adopted after her marriage, to Soaring Eagle, a woman who had found not just survival but purpose in the most unlikely circumstances imaginable. Around her, the sounds of the thriving community filled the morning air with a music that spoke of success measured not in wealth or power, but in the creation of meaning from hardship, family from strangers, and hope from the ashes of everything that had been lost. Children who would grow up knowing multiple languages and traditions played games that incorporated elements from half a dozen cultures, while their parents worked on projects that would have been impossible without the skills and knowledge that each person had brought from their previous lives. Soaring Eagle approached from the direction of the trading post, where he had been meeting with representatives from a geographical survey team that was mapping the canyon country for the territorial government. His expression carried satisfaction mixed with careful alertness, the look of someone who had successfully navigated another challenging interaction with the outside world while protecting his community's essential secrets. Their offering, payment for detailed maps of the northern canyons, he reported, settling beside Isabella on the rock where they often came to discuss the day's events. Good money, and it would establish us further as legitimate guides rather than mysterious recluses. Isabella nodded thoughtfully, her mind already working through the implications and opportunities that such an arrangement might create. This was how they lived now, always thinking several moves ahead, always looking for ways to strengthen their position while maintaining the freedom that made their lives worth living. "Any signs that they suspect what we really are?" she asked, voicing the question that was never far from either of their minds. Soaring Eagle smiled, the expression transforming his scarred features in ways that still made Isabella's heart skip. "After all their years together, they think we're just another family of guides who know the country well. It never occurs to them that people like us could create something like this." Looking out over the hidden valley that had become their world, Isabella understood exactly what he meant. The community they had helped build existed so far outside the categories that most people used to understand social organization that it was essentially invisible, even when it was operating in plain sight. They had achieved the ultimate form of hiding, not by concealing themselves, but by becoming something that their potential enemies couldn't recognize as a threat. The mail-order bride who had fled through the Utah canyons in a torn wedding dress had discovered something that very few people in any era achieve. Not just the transformation of self that comes from surviving extreme hardship, but the creation of something entirely new that honored both individual identity and collective purpose. She had found her way home, not by returning to what she had known before, but by building something unprecedented from the materials that courage and necessity had provided. As the sun climbed higher over the red rock walls that protected their sanctuary, Isabella Takes Horse allowed herself a moment of profound satisfaction. The woman who had once measured success by the security of marriage and the approval of conventional society now understood that true freedom came from the ability to create meaning from whatever circumstances life provided and to build family from the people brave enough to share that creation. The hidden valley would face new challenges as the world continued to change around it. But Isabella had learned something during her journey from desperation to fulfillment that would serve her community well. that the most powerful form of resistance was not fighting against what threatened to destroy you, but becoming something so authentically valuable that the world had no choice but to find ways to accommodate your existence. The mail-order bride's escape had become something far greater than a simple survival story. It had become the foundation for a new way of being human in a world that seemed determined to reduce everyone to narrow categories and limited possibilities. And that, Isabella realized as she watched her adopted children play beside the stream that sustained all life in their sanctuary, was perhaps the most remarkable transformation of all. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.